So in this lecture, we're going to learn about plants, and we'll actually have two different videos. The first video, we will talk about the general characteristics of the plant kingdom, what the four groups of plants are, and then we will describe the first two groups, the non-vascular plants and the seedless vascular plants. And then we will have another video for gymnosperms and a third video for angiosperms. So let's get started. Just to put plants in context with all other living things, remember that there are three domains of life. And what that means is everything living belongs in one of these three domains. So we're not going to review the details of these, but just to recall, the archaea, these are what we call extremophiles. So an example here, the Methanococcus are organisms that live deep in the ocean where there really is very little or no oxygen and they produce methane gas. They are single-celled and they're prokaryotic, meaning they don't have any nuclei or other membrane-bound organelles. Bacteria you're probably more familiar with. They're also single-celled and prokaryotic. This first example, Lactobacillus, is what we would consider a good, bacteria, part of our microflora. And if you eat yogurt or take probiotics, this is a primary bacterium that would be found in that, and they colonize our digestive tract and other parts of our body and are helpful. Salmonella, the second one, is not helpful. It is a parasitic bacteria, so if you've ever had salmonella food poisoning, you understand that it's not a good thing. The third domain, Eukarya, what these organisms have in common is they're all eukaryotic, meaning they have membrane-bound organelles, like a nucleus. Some of these organelles are single-celled. Some of them may be multicellular, very large, like animals, many cells, or very large trees. There's four kingdoms: the animal kingdom, the fungi kingdom, and the protist kingdom. And our focus today is on the specific kingdom of plants. So let's talk about, if we look at the plant kingdom as a whole, what characteristics do we say, well, this makes these things plants? Well, we know that they're eukaryotic organisms, but they're not the only organisms that are eukaryotic. We know that they're multicellular, so we don't have single-celled plants, right? But they're not the only organisms that are multicellular. So this is a very important characteristic that is important to plants, and that is they undergo a process called photosynthesis. In order to do that, they have to have a pigment called chlorophyll. It's a green pigment, and it is the color that it is why plants have green leaves. It is what causes their green color. Now, generally, what photosynthesis says is it means that they can make their own food using light. So, auto means self, and troph means feeding. So autotroph would mean self-feeding, or these organisms can produce their own food. And the photo part of this means light. So generally what we say is, well, a plant can take carbon dioxide gas, which there's an excess in the atmosphere. They take water from the soil, so through their roots, and using the energy that comes from the sun, they convert the carbon dioxide and water into fuel, or in this case, we could say carbohydrate. So that would be, we might say that's sugar, like glucose, that can be converted into starch. So if you think about when you eat potatoes or other squash or other vegetables, you know that you're getting starch. Now, oxygen is a byproduct that they produce, but the key thing that I want you to see is they're self-feeding. They make their own food, and because of that, they're actually the base of most of our food chain. So if you think about the things that you eat, if it's not a plant, let's say meat, hamburger meat or steak, comes from a cow, and those cows then directly get their food from plants, whether it's grass or hay or oats. So if you really think about it, any land food chain is going to have plants at the base of it. Now, another important component of plants is that their cell wall is made of something called cellulose. Now, when we eat plants, much of what we eat we use as energy. So like the starch that we get, we use as an energy source. There are vitamins and minerals that we get from eating plants that we use. But the cellulose part of plant cell walls is actually not something that we use either as nutrition or as energy. It is sort of fiber to help keep us regular. Doesn't mean it's not good for us, right? It's just not used as an energy source. Okay, we're going to talk about that plants reproduce sexually. In other words, there's two parents. They can reproduce asexually, but the sexual reproduction helps to create more diversity. Now, their life cycle is much different than ours in that we call it an alternation of generations, and we're going to talk in detail about this in just a minute. And land plants are called embryophytes, and what that means is that the embryo or the baby plant is protected. It remains attached to the parent. So I mentioned to you that alternation of generations life cycle, and this is true for all four groups of plants that we're going to talk about. And I just want to go over a very generalized version of it, and then as we go through each group, we'll look at this generation according to that specific group. But the first thing I want you to see is we're just going to, divide this figure in half. The top half that's yellow is haploid, and remember, haploid just means a single copy of chromosomes, only one copy. The bottom half is diploid, and that means there's two copies of every chromosome. Now, there are two basic life forms, and one is called the sporophyte, and the other is called the gametophyte. And you'll notice that the sporophyte is diploid, and the gametophyte is haploid. Now, if you think about us or other animals, in our life cycle, we are diploid our entire life cycle. The only time we have haploid cells is when we produce our gametes, so egg or sperm. As soon as the egg and sperm fuse, that first cell, right, of the zygote is diploid, and we are diploid for the rest of the life cycle. Now, in this case, there's actually two life forms instead of just having only the gametes. So let's follow this a little bit. Let's begin with the sporophyte. So the sporophyte will undergo a cell division called meiosis. And you don't have to recall the details of meiosis, but hopefully you can remember that this is a reduction cell division. What that means is it takes the chromosome number and it cuts it in half. So the sporophyte is diploid, but the spores that are produced after meiosis are going to have their chromosome number cut in half, meaning they're now haploid. They only have one copy. Now, a spore can be carried by wind or some other way and germinate. And by germinate, I mean it's going to begin dividing. So this type of cell division, mitosis, just creates an exact copy. So if we have a haploid cell that divides, we'll have two haploid cells, and those two will divide and have four haploid cells. Eventually, we will get a multicellular form that is all haploid. That's what the gametophyte is. This gametophyte then is going to produce gametes. So these gametes are the egg and the sperm. They're both still haploid, but when they fuse, one copy plus one copy restores the diploid zygote. Okay, and this zygote is essentially the first cell, right, of the new baby plant, and it will divide by mitosis again to form the sporophyte. So I have a few notes for you here just to remind you that the gametophyte is haploid, and that is going to produce the gametes, sperm and egg. Once those fuse, they restore the diploid nature in the zygote. The sporophyte is diploid, and how do we get a haploid gametophyte? Well, by division of meiosis. Now, land plants can be divided into four groups. The simplest or non-vascular, which includes mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. Those that have vascular tissue but still no seeds, we call those seedless vascular plants. An example of that would be ferns. Then we have vascular seed plants. the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. The difference being angiosperms are flowering. So we'll save those for later, but let's talk for just a minute about the bryophytes. Okay, non-vascular, they don't have any vascular tissue, and they don't make seeds. Now in this picture, what you could see down here in this area is probably something that you would recognize as a moss, okay? And then you see these shoots coming up, okay, that maybe you wouldn't necessarily recognize as a moss, because their sperm must swim to fertilize the egg. So why I say depend on water, not just because they need water for photosynthesis, but for actual fertilization. Now, this is the only group of plants that the gametophyte is what we call the dominant generation. And by dominant, what I mean by that is when you look at the plant and you say this is a moss, what you recognize as that's the generation we're talking about is dominant. So for example, when you look out on this and you see all the green portion, right, that's what you would recognize as a moss. And so that would be the dominant generation. And in this case, that is the gametophyte. Now, the reddish-brown shoots that are coming up here, those are actually the sporophyte generation, and notice that they're still attached to the gametophyte. They are dependent on that generation. So examples of bryophytes would be mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. Probably mosses are those you're most familiar with. Their size is limited simply because they don't have vascular tissue. And again, they don't make seeds, so no vascular tissue, no seeds. The way that they reproduce is with spores. And here is the alternation of generations life cycle for bryophytes, and I want to point out a couple of things before we walk through it. And the first is that they're going to have two separate gametophytes, a male and a female, and the female gametophyte is going to have a structure the female is going to have a structure called the archegonium, and the archegonium is responsible for producing the egg, right? The female gamete, which is the egg. The antheridium is the male structure, the male gametophyte, and it is responsible for producing the sperm, right, which is the male gamete. Now remember, this sperm is swimming. It has to have water in order to get to fertilize the egg. So let's follow. Let's start from this first spore here. Okay, one of these, we have two spores. So as you follow, the spore is actually haploid, okay? And once the spore begins to germinate, meaning divide, right, it's going to divide to produce either a male gametophyte or a female, so we have both types. They're still haploid, right? They're multicellular, but every cell is haploid. Now, in these gametophytes, depending on if we're talking about the female or the male, they're going to form or produce the gamete. So in the female archegonium, we see the production of an egg, and in the male antheridium, we see production of the sperm. So the sperm is going to swim, okay? So you see here, here's a sperm swimming to fertilize that egg. And once the egg is fertilized, so we have one copy from the sperm, one copy from the egg, and now we have a diploid embryo, right? Two copies. So this is crossed into the sporophyte generation because it's diploid. Now what happens is this structure that you see, okay, is sort of shown very, very large, but it's at the top, right, of this gametophyte. So this structure then begins to grow out of or above the gametophyte. So the gametophyte is the moss body that we recognize. The sporophyte is still attached and is growing up from the gametophyte itself. The spores then are released, okay? After they go through meiosis, the spores are going to be released, and then we start the cycle over again. So the sporophyte in this case is not the dominant generation. It is supported by the gametophyte. Every other group of plants we talk about, the sporophyte is going to be dominant. So that's one very important characteristic about the bryophytes. Next, we move on to the second group, which are the seedless vascular plants, or ferns, as you see here. So they have vascular tissue. That's something extra that the mosses or the bryophytes didn't have, but we still have seeds. Now, they are thought to have been the dominant form of plant tissue during the Carboniferous period, and the remains of these over time are thought to be what produced the oil, coal, the kind of petroleum products that we have underground today. Vascular tissue. So our vascular tissue is arteries and veins. Plants' vascular tissue are called xylem and phloem. Xylem is, you can think of like sort of roots carrying it from the ground up, water and minerals distributed throughout the plant. The phloem is actually carrying solutes like sugars and proteins. So we know that plants are undergoing photosynthesis, and photosynthesis typically happens in the leaves, but other parts of the plants, are going to need sugars. So it gets transferred, right, throughout the plant. Roots now are going to help stabilize and carry more, reach out to get water, right, from under the ground and carry them to the plant. Also, they allow these organisms to grow a little bit larger than the bryophytes. So as I mentioned, from now on, the dominant generation is going to be the sporophyte. These still need water because they have sperm that have to swim to the egg. Now, if you are familiar with ferns, if you've ever had any ferns, you recognize this is what the leaves look like. But if you look at the underneath side of the leaves, they have these yellowish orange circular bodies called sporangia. Sometimes they're called sori, right? A group of these sporangia are called sori. And what are these? Well, basically these are where the spores are located. And so once the spores are distributed, they can germinate. Okay. Remember, spores are haploid because the process of meiosis has cut that chromosome number in half. So here you see this very small gametophyte, and again we're going to have both the male and female version. So the antheridium is the male version that produces the sperm. Archegonium is the female version that produces the egg. Once those come together, now we have our zygote, which is diploid, right? We're back into the sporophyte generation. And this single cell then is just going to divide by mitosis many times until we have a mature sporophyte generation. And this is what, when we look at a fern, right, this is what we would recognize as a fern. So later we're going to, in future videos, look at the gymnosperms and the angiosperms.